They were climbing a mountain to find a dead woman. That is what they expected. A frozen body. A simple ending to a sad story. A wife alone at a ranch in southern New Mexico. 3 weeks without word. A blizzard that had buried the valley for 6 days. The math was simple and cruel. But the girl saw it first. 16 years old, Wren Calloway, the blacksmith's daughter, who had followed the men up the mountain because no one could send her back. She pointed between 2 boulders near the ridgeline, and she said one sentence. "There is something up there, and it is moving." The men squinted. They saw it too, heat, a shimmer of warmth rising from the rocks on a day when nothing on that mountain should have been warm. The lead man knelt. Eamon Brackett, 50 years old, 30 winters in those hills. He placed his bare hand on the stone, and he pulled it back as if he had touched a stove. "It is warm," he said. The silence that followed had a quality none of them had experienced before. It was the silence of genuine astonishment. And then, from somewhere inside the mountain, they heard a sound. The sound of a lever sliding across stone. A wedge-shaped rock at the base of the wall began to move. Slowly. Outward, deliberately. As if someone on the other side knew exactly what they were doing. An opening appeared. Dark. Warm. From it came air that smelled of wood smoke and dry grass, and the contrast with the frozen world around them was the most shocking thing Eamon Brackett had ever felt in his life. A hand appeared in the opening, then an arm, then the rest of Maren Hollis crawling out into the snow with the calm of someone stepping through her own front door on an ordinary Tuesday. She stood, she looked at the men, she looked at Wren. She brushed the ice from her wool shawl with a practical motion that seemed to belong to a different season entirely. "Mr. Brackett," she said, "I was not expecting visitors, but since you are here, come in. I have the fire going." This is not a story about survival. This is a story about a woman who knew, who tried to warn them, who was laughed at, whispered about, and dismissed, and who built her own world inside a mountain. Alone, with bleeding hands. If you have ever been the woman no one listened to, stay with me. This one is for you. To understand what those men found that winter morning, we have to go back. 8 years and 4 months back. To the summer of 1879. Maren Hollis was 23 years old. Her hair was black and fell to her waist. Her eyes still held the particular brightness of a young woman who believed the next chapter would be better than the last. She had been an orphan since she was 16, when her grandmother Saoirse died in the Canyonlands near the southern border. And in the 7 years since then, Maren had learned that believing a man is sometimes the only luxury available to a woman with nothing else to spend. The man she believed was Cassius Thorne. He was the son of a landowner from the border country, dark-eyed, handsome in the way that certain men are handsome, which is to say that his face made promises his character had no intention of keeping. He spoke with the unhurried cadence of men who have grown up assuming the world owes them something simply for existing. He told Maren he had land in New Mexico. 40 acres at the foot of Ash Hill, with a spring that crossed the property and views that would take her breath away. He told her they would build something together. He told her she deserved a life worth living. And Maren had believed him. She was 23 and alone in the world. Belief was the only currency she possessed. The wagon train stopped at a way station 2 days outside of Ironwood Hollow. Maren stepped down to stretch her legs, and she saw an old woman sitting alone on the porch. White hair, bright eyes set deep in a face mapped with wrinkles. The woman watched Maren step down from the wagon, and then she watched Cassius walk ahead toward the water trough without looking back to see if his bride needed help with the step. The old woman said one thing, quietly, almost to herself. but loud enough for Maren to hear. A man who builds a house before his wife arrives usually builds it for himself, not for her. Maren did not understand the sentence at that moment. It lodged in her the way certain sentences do, like a seed dropped in dry soil. It did not germinate, but it did not die. The woman's name was Hetty Mosswood. Maren would learn that later. But here is the first thing you need to know about Hetty Mosswood. She had been waiting on that porch. Not for the wagon, not for the heat to break. She had been waiting for someone like Maren for 7 years. Because Hetty Mosswood had once been 23 years old, traveling west with a man whose face made promises his character had no intention of keeping, and Hetty Mosswood had survived him. That story belongs to a later chapter, but the seed she planted that afternoon, that seed mattered. The land existed. That much was true. 40 acres at the foot of Ash Hill. A spring crossing the property. Views that did, in fact, take Maren's breath when she first saw them from the ridge above the valley. Cassius had built an adobe cabin with his own hands before she arrived. Small but solid. Thick walls. A fireplace that drew well. A front porch that faced west toward sunsets that looked like the sky was being consumed by fire every evening. During the first months of marriage, when the New Mexico summer painted the flats in shades of ochre and the mesquite bloomed white along the creek banks, Maren thought that perhaps hope was not as fragile as she had feared. The land was beautiful. The cabin was warm. Cassius was attentive in the way that new husbands are attentive when the novelty of possession has not yet worn off. And then winter came. And with it came another version of Cassius Thorne. I am not going to describe what happened in detail. There are things that do not need to be described to be understood. The women who have been in that place know exactly what I am talking about. And the men who are listening, the good men, the ones who would never, you know enough to understand this. Maren spent 8 years learning to move through her own house with the silence of someone walking on ice. Reading the weather not from the sky but from the eyes of a man. Anticipating the shifts in climate that came not from the mountains but from inside the walls of her own home. 8 years. And those 8 years, though she did not know it then, were preparing her for something. To understand the rest of this story, you have to understand Saoirse. Saoirse Hollis was a woman of the border country, a midwife, an herbalist. She understood animals and the language of the sky with the same naturalness that other people understood the streets of their town. When Maren was a child and visited her in the summers, Saoirse would take her walking through the canyons and teach her to read the world. The world is always talking, child, Saoirse would say in that voice of hers, soft as water over stone. You just have to learn to be quiet enough to hear it. There was one night Maren remembered with perfect clarity. She was 10 years old. They had been caught in a canyon by a sudden storm. Rain coming down so hard the arroyos filled in minutes. No shelter anywhere. Maren cried. Because she was 10, because she was wet, because she was afraid. Saoirse did not panic. She found a place where the canyon wall had a natural overhang, and in the space of 2 hours, using flat stones and red mud from the canyon floor, she built a shelter that kept them dry through the night. Maren watched her grandmother's hands moving in the lantern light, placing stone against stone, pressing mud into the joints. And she asked the question, "Who taught you to do this, grandmother?" Saoirse smiled. The animals. They build their nests without anyone teaching them, because they listen with their whole bodies, not just their ears. Maren carried those lessons inside her the way people carry the things that do not fit in any suitcase, but that cannot be left behind. And in the years of enforced silence in Cassius Thorne's house, she had begun to listen again. Not just to her husband, to everything. It was in the autumn of 1886 when the signs began to speak with a clarity that cut her breath short. The squirrels were not simply gathering acorns, they were frantic, accumulating with a desperation that went far beyond their usual autumn diligence. Building caches in places Marin had never seen them used before. Working from before dawn until after dark, the pine cones on the old junipers were completely sealed, their scales locked shut with resin, as if the trees were preparing to withstand a siege. The beavers at the spring had built their dam higher than Marin had ever seen it, reinforcing it with a thick layer of mud and branches that spoke of an urgency she had never witnessed in 20 years of watching those animals. And the cranes. The cranes were not flying south in their usual loose formation. They were flying in tight, urgent groups. Lower, faster, as if they were running from something that was already close behind them. Marin tried to warn someone. She was standing in the Fairchild General Store one afternoon, and Eamon Brackett was there, buying rope, talking to Anil Fairchild about cattle prices, the way the men of that valley always talked about cattle prices, as if the future were a stable and predictable thing that could be managed with enough rope and enough feed. "Mr. Brackett," she said, "this winter is going to be different. I have never seen the squirrels behave like this. The pine cones have been sealed since August. The beavers have reinforced the dam 3 times in 2 weeks. Brackett looked at her. He was not an unkind man. He was a practical man, 50 years old, 30 years in those mountains, and he had the particular confidence of men who have survived enough winters to believe they understand all of them. He smiled. Not cruelly, but with that slight condescension that practical men sometimes show to knowledge they cannot categorize. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, "I have been living in these mountains since before you were born. Winter is winter. Squirrels are always frantic. That is what squirrels do." Then he turned back to Anil Fairchild and continued talking about cattle prices. Marin stood there a moment longer, not because she was waiting for him to turn back, because she was measuring the distance between what she knew and what the world was willing to hear. That distance was as wide as the valley itself. Standing near the dry goods shelf, close enough to hear, was a woman named Prudence Whitlock. Prudence was 40 years old, the wife of a small rancher named Alonzo Whitlock, a church-going woman who attended every Sunday service and every Wednesday prayer meeting. She had strong opinions about the proper behavior of Christian women, and she had 2 small children, including a boy of 5 named Tobias. After Marin left the store, Prudence leaned toward Tabitha Fairchild, who was sorting bolts of fabric behind the counter. "Mrs. Thorne is talking strangely again," Prudence said. "Reading the sky, reading squirrels. My mother back in Missouri had a word for women like that, and it was not a kind word. I am not saying she is that. I am only saying that a woman of faith does not wander alone on a mountainside every morning the way she does." Tabitha Fairchild tilted her head, but said nothing. It was the kind of silence that small communities cultivate when they do not want trouble. Not agreement exactly, not disagreement, just the quiet complicity of people who find it easier to let a judgment stand than to challenge it. Remember Prudence Whitlock. Remember her name. Because in 11 months the boy named Tobias would be coughing himself toward death, and the only person who could save him would be the woman she had just whispered about. A week later, Marin met Hetty Mosswood at the spring. It was the first time they had been close enough to speak since the way station 7 years before. Hetty lived alone at the edge of Ironwood Hollow. In a small adobe house she kept immaculate, and that no one visited very often, because Hetty was old and had no family, and the town had decided years ago that she was a peripheral figure in its life. Marin was filling a clay jug. Hetty stood watching her for a long time before speaking. "You are getting ready to leave him." not a question, a statement. Maren froze, her hand on the rope of the jug, her heart suddenly very loud in her chest. "How did you—" "I am 75 years old, child," Hetty said. "I have lived in this country since before this town had a name. I have seen women arrive with the same look you had 8 years ago. Some of them left. Some of them did not." Maren did not speak. Hetty looked up at the mountains. "Every woman has to find her own way," she said. "But you are not alone. There were others before you. There will be others after you." And then, gently, she added one more thing. "Your grandmother, she taught you to read the world?" Maren nodded. Hetty smiled. A slow, careful smile. "Then you already have everything you need. You just have not arranged it yet." She turned and walked back toward her small adobe house. And Maren stood at the spring with her hand on the jug and her chest aching with a feeling she could not name. For the first time in 8 years, someone had seen her. Not pitied her, not judged her, not whispered about her, seen her, and had told her, without quite saying it, that she was not the first. There was something else happening in Ironwood Hollow that autumn, something Maren did not yet know about. A 16-year-old girl had been watching her. Wren Calloway was the daughter of Reuben Calloway, the blacksmith. She had the particular quality of certain young people who have learned to observe before they speak. She was not shy, she was watchful. She carried a small notebook in which she drew plants and animals, and the faces of people in town with a precision that made some adults uncomfortable. For nearly a year, Wren had been drawing Maren Hollis, without telling anyone, without telling Maren herself. Just pages of her notebook filled with sketches of the woman who lived at the foot of Ash Hill. The woman who walked the upper slopes every morning with her shawl wrapped tight. The woman who stood in the Fairchild store and tried to explain about squirrels while everyone else looked at the floor. There was one drawing in particular, Maren, standing at the edge of the spring, looking up at the mountainside. The expression on her face not sad, not lost, something else. Wren had written one sentence beneath it. She is calculating something. The girl had seen what no adult in Ironwood Hollow had seen, that Maren Hollis was not losing her mind. She was deciding. September came. And on a particular afternoon late in the month, Maren walked the upper slopes of Ash Hill, as she did every afternoon when she could escape the house, following a path she had worn smooth over years of solitary walking. She passed behind a dense stand of creosote bush, and she saw something she had never noticed before, a dark cleft in the gray rock face, almost perfectly hidden by the brush. Narrow, vertical, the kind of opening that most people would have assumed was a coyote den or a javelina burrow, a place to avoid. But when Maren moved closer and looked inside, she did not feel a current of cold air flowing outward. What she felt was something entirely different, a pocket of air that was still, stable, protected, not warm exactly, but not cold either, insulated, sealed off from the wind and the weather by millions of years of stone. She stood at the mouth of that fissure for a long time, her hand on the cold rock, feeling that quiet air on her face. And she knew, with the same certainty with which she knew how to make flour tortillas, or read the shift of the wind before a storm, that inside there was enough space. She came back the next morning with a kerosene lamp. She crawled through the entrance. The cavern was larger than she had imagined from outside. The opening was narrow, barely enough for one person to pass through, crouching. But inside, it opened into a chamber roughly 13 feet wide by 20 feet long, the ceiling highest in the center, nearly 8 feet. The walls were solid basaltic rock, the ancient stone of the southern ranges that has been there for millions of years, and has no plans to move. And at the far end of the chamber, Maren saw something that stopped her completely. A vertical crack in the back wall, thin as two fingers pressed together, running from the floor upward until it disappeared into the ceiling. A thread of air moved through that crack, and when Maren lit the lamp and held the flame close to it, the flame did not bend inward toward the crack. It bent upward, toward the ceiling, a natural chimney. She stared at that crack for a long time. Then she turned off the lamp to save kerosene. She sat on the floor of the cave in complete darkness, and she listened. The silence of that cave was unlike any silence she had ever experienced. It was the silence of stone. It had weight and temperature and texture. It was the silence of something that had existed far longer than any human problem, and would continue to exist long after every problem had been resolved or dissolved or forgotten entirely. In the darkness, Maren thought of her grandmother. Sarsa had built a shelter for one night. Maren would build one for a winter. Here, Maren thought, this is the place. That night, lying in bed beside the man who had taught her to be silent for 8 years, Maren made the only decision she had left to make. It was not a decision born from a single moment. It was a seed that had been growing in silence for years, fed by every morning she woke up afraid, and every night she fell asleep relieved that another day had passed. It was a seed watered by her grandmother's lessons, and by the signs the animals had been sending for months, and by that quiet air rising from the belly of the mountain like a promise. She would not wait out the winter in Cassius Thorne's house. She would build herself a place of her own, a place where no storm, not the storm from the sky, and not the storm from the man, could reach her. She would need months. She would need to work without anyone knowing. She would need to become even more invisible than she already was, which was, when she thought about it, an advantage that 8 years of living with Cassius had given her. She already knew how to disappear. The work began the way all secret things begin. In the early hours when the world belongs to the people who have reasons to be awake that they cannot share with anyone else. October 1886. Each morning before Cassius stirred in the bedroom, Maren rose in the dark and dressed without sound, and slipped out the back door of the cabin while the stars were still sharp above Ash Hill. She had approximately 3 hours, 3 hours that belonged entirely to her. 3 hours in which she was simply a person with a purpose, climbing a mountainside in the blue dark, with her hands already anticipating the work ahead. The first task was the chimney, because the chimney was the first real test of whether this entire endeavor was possible, or whether she was, as Prudence had suggested, a woman whose mind had wandered too far from the path. A natural crack in rock is not a functioning chimney. It has no controlled draft, no defined direction for smoke, no way to prevent wind from reversing the flow. The mortar was a mixture of red clay from the spring, fine sand, and wood ash. The same recipe her grandmother had used to seal the cooking hearth in the canyon lands. Maren knew the proportions by feel, by the way the mixture held together when she squeezed it in her fist, by the way it smelled when it was right. She worked on the chimney for a month, 1 stone at a time, 1 layer of mortar at a time. The test came on an afternoon in November. Maren lit a small fire in the finished hearth, and she sat on the cave floor, and she watched the smoke. It rose straight and clean, without hesitation, and entered the stone channel she had built, with a certainty that seemed almost grateful, as if the smoke had always known where it wanted to go, and had only been waiting for someone to show it the path. Maren closed her eyes and breathed slowly. The chimney worked, and sitting by that first small fire, she thought something she had not allowed herself to think before. This is not a hiding place. This is a place I am building. The difference between those two words, hiding and building, was the distance between a woman running from something and a woman running towards something. She crossed that distance in that moment, and she did not cross back. In the second week of December, something happened Maren had not expected. She walked down to the spring at first light to fill a jug, and she found a small canvas sack waiting on the flat rock where she always set her bucket. Inside the sack, lime, 2 pounds of it, clean, fresh, better quality than anything sold in town. No note. Maren stood there with the sack in her hands, and her heart suddenly very loud in her chest. She looked around. The slopes were empty. The smoke from her own chimney was rising thin and gray against the cold sky. There was no one. But she knew. She thought of an old woman with white hair and bright eyes set deep in a face mapped with wrinkles. A woman who had said 7 years before that a man who builds a house before his wife arrives builds it for himself. Maren walked the lime up to the cave that morning, and she said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. 2 weeks later, she baked a loaf of bread, a small one, dark crust, just the way old people like it. And she walked into town in the late afternoon and left it on the wooden bench beside Hetty Mosswood's front door. No note, no knock. She did not look back. A week after that, a coil of good rope appeared at the entrance to the cave, folded neatly, out of the snow. This, Maren understood now, was how women had been helping each other for thousands of years. Not in speeches, not in declarations, not in great public acts of solidarity that the world remembers, but in small offerings left in quiet places, lime in a canvas sack, bread on a bench, rope at a cave mouth. Hetty Mosswood was 75 years old. She could not climb the mountain herself. She could not lift the stones. She could not mortar the walls. But she could buy what an old woman alone in the world could plausibly buy. And she could leave it in the right places at the right times. And she did for 7 months, without ever saying a single word about it to anyone. The bed was the project of February. Maren did not want a cot. A cot was temporary, a thing that could be undone. She wanted something permanent, something that said, "This place is not a refuge. It is a home." She built a platform from flat pieces of flagstone that she had been separating from the rocky outcrops on the slope for months, carrying them down to the cave 1 or 2 at a time in the folded shawl she used as a sling. She raised the platform 12 inches off the cave floor using blocks of basalt as supports, and she covered the surface with the smoothest flagstones she could find, leveling them with wedges of cottonwood until the platform was perfectly horizontal. She did not explain to herself, in those months, why she had chosen to build a stone bed instead of a wooden one. Stone absorbs heat when fire burns nearby during the day, and releases that heat slowly through the night. A well-made stone bed is a radiator that works while its occupant sleeps. Maren knew this because her grandmother had told her about the heated mud sleeping platforms used by certain peoples of the Northern Territories, and because her own body had taught her across 8 winters that the cold, which rises from the ground, reaches the bones before the skin knows it is there. On top of the platform she accumulated the mattress. Not all at once, but over the course of the entire winter, dry grass from the flats below, cut in autumn while still green, cattail fluff from the spring, feathers from birds she found dead on the slopes. When the mattress was finished in March, Maren lay on it for the first time. No fire, no lamp, just a test. She slept 3 hours. The most peaceful 3 hours she had experienced in 8 years. She woke not to the sound of boots on a porch, or a voice calling her name with an edge she had to interpret instantly, but to the deep, unhurried silence of stone. And for a moment she did not know where she was, and then she did, and she closed her eyes again, and let herself feel what it was like to wake up without fear. In the second week of March, on a morning when the snow had finally begun to thin from the lower slopes but still clung stubbornly to the upper ridges, Wren Calloway came to the spring at dawn to fill the buckets for the smithy. She watched from behind the willow at the edge of the spring. A figure, hooded, heavy skirt, walking the way Wren had seen her walking for almost a year now, with the careful balance of someone who has learned that the ground beneath her feet might lie. It was Maren Hollis, and as she came closer, Wren saw something Maren had clearly not noticed yet. Her hands, gray, caked with dried mortar that she had not stopped to wash off in her hurry to make it down the slope before her husband woke. Wren stepped out from behind the willow. "Good morning, Mrs. Thorne." Maren startled. She had not known anyone was watching. She looked at Wren. Then she looked down at her own hands, and she saw the mortar she had forgotten. For a moment, two women stood in the gray light of early morning at the edge of a frozen spring, and the truth was visible on Maren's hands, and neither of them said a word about it. Wren saw the mortar. Maren saw that Wren saw, and in that exchange of seeing, something was established between them that did not require language. Wren raised her hand. A small wave, held low, near her waist. It meant, "I see. I will not speak." Maren nodded. Then both turned away. And neither of them mentioned that morning to anyone for the rest of their lives. Not everyone in Ironwood Hollow had Wren's instinct for silence. The Sunday after Wren saw Maren on the slope, Prudence Whitlock cornered Reverend Beaumont outside the small wooden church where the entire town gathered every week to remind themselves that they were good people. Reverend Beaumont was an old man, gentle by nature, slow to judge, but susceptible to the persistent concern of a parishioner who framed her suspicion as Christian duty. "Reverend," Prudence said, her voice pitched to carry just far enough. "I worry for Mrs. Thorne, walking the mountain every morning, buying supplies she cannot explain. No children. Her husband absent more than present. A woman in that condition. The mind can wander in dangerous directions." The Reverend nodded slowly. He had performed this kind of conversation many times. He knew his role, so he agreed. He would visit Mrs. Thorne, as a pastor, as a friend. The Reverend mounted his horse 3 days later and rode out to the Thorne ranch. Maren was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she saw him ride up. She knew before he dismounted that someone had sent him. Ministers do not make social calls on ranches 5 miles from town without a reason. He was kind, he was indirect. He asked if she was well, if she needed anything, if the solitude was difficult. Maren answered each question with the calm precision of a woman who had spent 8 years managing conversations with men who held power over her life. When the Reverend finally asked, "Where do you spend your mornings, Mrs. Thorne?" Maren looked directly into his eyes. "I gather medicinal herbs, Reverend. My grandmother was a midwife. I keep her practice." The Reverend nodded, satisfied. He had the answer he needed to report back that he had done his duty. But as he rode away, Maren stood watching his horse grow smaller on the road, and she felt something she had not felt before in all the months of building. She felt time running out. The work that had been measured in seasons now needed to be measured in weeks. It was in April that Cassius nearly destroyed everything. He came home one evening earlier than expected. The whiskey was in his eyes, but not in his hands, which meant he was at that particular stage of drunkenness where he thought he was sharper than he actually was, which was, in some ways, the most dangerous stage. Maren was sewing by the lamp. He sat across from her at the table. He watched her for a long time without speaking. She did not look up. Then he spoke. "Tabitha Fairchild told me something interesting today." Maren did not stop sewing. "Did she?" She said you bought 20 pounds of lime last month from 3 different stores, spread out, like you didn't want anyone to notice. A single missed stitch. She caught herself before he could see. Lime is for the chicken coop caches, the west wall. You said that in October. It is a slow repair. 6 months slow. I am one person. The silence that followed had the particular quality of a held breath. She set the sewing in her lap. If you would like to inspect the chicken coop caches, I will hold the lantern for you in the morning. He laughed, short, bitter. Maybe I will. He stood, he walked into the bedroom. He closed the door. Maren sat at the table, her hands very still. If he goes to the coop in the morning, he will see that the west wall has not been repaired, and he will know, not the cave, not yet. He has not seen the cave, but he will know that I have been lying to him, systematically, for months. That is enough. That is more than enough. She stood up very slowly. She listened at the bedroom door. His breathing was already slow. The whiskey had taken him faster than she had expected. She picked up the lantern. She put on her boots and her shawl, and she went out into the freezing April night. To the chicken coop, to break a hole in the west wall, to make the lie true. She worked for 2 hours in the cold, pulling adobe bricks loose from the wall with a chisel, smearing wet mortar around the opening, making it look like she had been patching a real problem for months. By the time she was finished, her hands were bleeding. Her back was screaming. The wind had cut through her shawl and into her bones. But the chicken coop now had a half-repaired wall, and she had a story that would hold. In the morning, Cassius walked out to the coop with her. He looked at the broken section. He looked at the partial repair. He grunted. He turned around. He went back inside. He never asked about lime again. But Maren stood there for a long time after he left. I am running out of lies. I am running out of time. By June, the walls of the cave were nearly finished. Her body was failing. Her shoulders ached constantly. The skin on her hands had cracked and bled and cracked again, until the mortar was permanently embedded in the lines of her palms and under her nails. There were mornings when her arms were too heavy to lift above her head. On a particular morning in mid-June, Maren could not make it past the halfway point on the slope. Her legs simply stopped. She sat down on a flat rock with her back against a juniper, and she looked down at the roof of the cabin where Cassius was still sleeping, and she looked up at the ridgeline where the cave waited, and for the first time in all the months of work, a thought arrived that she had not invited. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe Prudence is right. Maybe the winter will be ordinary and everything I am doing is the project of a lonely woman who has lost her mind. Maybe the squirrels were just being squirrels. She sat with that thought for 20 minutes. She did not push it away. She did not argue with it. She let it sit next to her on the rock, the way you let an unwelcome visitor sit in your house, when you are too tired to show them the door. Then she looked at her hands. They were destroyed. Cracks, stains. The mortar ground into every line and crevice. The nails broken short. The knuckles swollen. They were not the hands of a woman who had lost her mind. They were the hands of a woman who had built a chimney that drew clean in any wind. A stone platform that held heat through the night. Walls that sealed a cave against weather and time. These hands had done those things. These hands were not crazy. Maren stood up. She climbed the rest of the slope, and she did not say a word about that morning to anyone for the rest of her life. That afternoon, Cassius came home early. Maren was crossing the yard from the henhouse when he appeared on the porch, and she saw his eyes drop to her hands before she had a chance to hide them. The gray mortar was there, dried into the creases of her fingers, unmistakable if you were looking for it. "What is on your hands?" Maren looked down. Her heart was beating hard, but something was different this time. Something had changed on the mountainside that morning. Perhaps it was because she had almost quit, and had not quit. She looked directly at Cassius. "If you want me to wash my hands, I will wash them." Not defiance, not challenge, just flat and level, and completely without the flinch he was accustomed to seeing. Cassius stared at her, and in his eyes, Marin saw something she had never seen there before: confusion. He did not know how to read this version of her. She did not lower her gaze. He did not raise his hand. After a moment that stretched long enough to hold the weight of 8 years, he turned and walked into the house. Something had shifted in the house that did not shift back. He watched her differently for a few days, with the wariness of a man who has discovered that a door he assumed was locked has been open for some time, and he does not know how long, and he does not know what has passed through it. July brought the heat. August brought the provisions: dried meat from game she hunted with her .32 caliber carbine, beans, lentils, flour stored in clay pots sealed with beeswax she harvested from the wild hives on the hillside, firewood gathered only as fallen wood, carried in a leather net slung on her back, months of fuel, organized by type, ready. One afternoon in August, Marin was carrying a load of firewood up the slope when she looked down, and she saw Wren standing at the spring 200 yards below. Looking up, the two of them regarded each other across that distance. Wren raised her hand in a small wave, held low near the waist. Marin nodded. Then both turned away. But that night Wren took out her notebook, and she added a new sketch: Marin on the slope, a bundle of wood across her shoulders, her face turned toward the ridge. Beneath it, Wren wrote one sentence: "She is preparing for something none of us can see yet." The next morning, she walked down to the spring before her father was awake, and she left her notebook on the flat rock where she knew Marin would come. When Marin came down the slope an hour later, she found the notebook. She lifted it. She read what was inside: plant sketches, animal sketches, drawings of the way beavers reinforced their dams, drawings of how squirrels stored acorns in unusual locations, notes on the behavior of cranes. The girl had been learning, for months, without telling anyone. Marin held the notebook in her hands for a long moment, and she felt something that surprised her: pride. She set the notebook back on the rock, exactly as she had found it. But that night, she went to the small wooden chest where she kept her grandmother's leather journal, the book of remedies, the book of medicinal plants, the book that had been her grandmother's life, and she carried it down the next morning, wrapped in a small piece of oilcloth, and she tucked it into the hollow of a rock near the spring, where the morning light would catch it, where someone with a careful eye would see. The next morning, the journal was gone. 2 days later, it returned, to the same hollow, with the oilcloth carefully retied. Some of the pages had been read, not roughly, not damaged, but read, and tucked into the back of the book. A small folded piece of paper, Wren's handwriting, 3 words: "Thank you, teacher." Marin held that paper in her hands, and her eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with grief. Knowledge was being transferred, not through schools, not through speeches, through a book left in a hollow rock, through a girl who had been watching for a year, through a chain of women that nobody had named yet, but that had been forming in the silence beneath everything. By September, Marin had shifted from the question of whether to the question of when. The cave was nearly complete. The provisions were nearly sufficient. The winter the animals had been announcing for a full year was approaching with the punctuality of all inevitable things. The answer came in early October. Cassius announced he was riding to town to see a man about a cattle deal, and would be gone 3 to 5 days. The next morning, Cassius rode out before dawn. Marin stood on the porch and watched him go, the shape of him leaning slightly right in the saddle, the way he always leaned, growing smaller against the gray flats, until he disappeared around the bend in the road. She waited until she could no longer hear the horse. Then she went inside, and she began. That night she did everything she always did. Cooked dinner she would not eat, washed the dishes, went to bed at her usual hour. But she did not sleep. She lay in the dark making her final inventory, the heaviest clothes, the whetstone, the carbine, the ammunition, one book, the handwritten one her grandmother had given her, and the money. $22 she had saved, penny by penny, over years, hidden in the sewn hem of her heaviest petticoat. At 3 a.m, with the full moon illuminating the fresh snow on the peaks, Marin gathered her bundle, wrapped herself in her heaviest wool shawl, opened the back door of the house without a sound, and walked toward the slope, without looking back. The climb with the full load took nearly 2 hours in darkness and cold. She slipped on a frost-covered stone and fell to her knees, and stayed there for a moment, palms flat on the cold earth, breath turning to vapor in the October air. She got up. She kept going. When she reached the outer wall and found the keystone with numb fingers and pushed it inward, and crawled through the opening, and passed through the airlock and entered the main chamber. The air was still, and cold, but still. Finally still. No wind, no sound of boots on boards, no breathing she had to monitor for changes in rhythm that might signal danger. She sat on the floor with her back against the mortared wall, and she did not light the lamp. She stayed in complete darkness for a time she could not measure, and in that darkness, Marin did something she had not done in a very long time. She cried, not from sadness exactly, though there was sadness in it, not from relief exactly, though there was relief. She cried the way a body cries when it has been held rigid for too long, and suddenly finds itself in a place where there is no longer any reason to hold. Silently, the way she had learned to do everything. Hands over her face, back against the stone wall that was still cold, but that she knew, with time and fire, would become warm when she finished. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She found the flint and steel. She lit the candle. She built the fire. The small flame reflected off the smoothed mortar walls, and the chamber took shape. The firewood, the shelves, the provisions, the hearth, the stone bed with its thick mattress. She sat on the edge of the stone bed and listened to the quiet of the chamber that was now her own. Outside, the October wind was gathering strength. Inside, Marin Hollis was home. Cassius Thorne came home 2 days early. He did not tell anyone why. The house was clean. That was the first thing he noticed. Not empty, clean. The kind of clean a woman leaves behind when she does not intend to come back. The bed was made, the dishes were dry, the boots that had stood by the front door for 8 years were gone. He walked into the bedroom. He opened the wardrobe. Half her clothes were still there, but the heavy clothes, the wool, the thick gray shawl her grandmother had given her, gone. The pantry was organized. Not stripped. Organized. Enough food for him, not enough food for 2. She had cooked his last meal, wrapped it, left it on the counter under a clean cloth. A woman who is leaving in a panic does not leave food for the man she is fleeing. Marin had not left in a panic. She had left on a schedule. He sat down at the kitchen table. He sat there for a very long time, and as the dark came down on the empty house, Cassius Thorne began, for the first time in his life, to feel a thing he could not bully into submission. He felt afraid, not of her. He had never been afraid of her, afraid of the silence she had left behind. He rode into Ironwood Hollow at first light. He went to every store, every neighboring ranch. Nobody had seen Maren Hollis. By the third morning, the valley was white. The sky had gone the color of hammered lead. And inside the cabin, Cassius Thorne stood at the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand and watched a world he no longer recognized close itself around him. He thought he understood what had happened. He thought she had run, toward town, toward the train, toward whatever fool man had filled her head with stories. She had not made it. The storm had caught her on the road. She was somewhere out there. He saddled his horse. His ranch hands tried to stop him. They told him the road was already gone. They told him no horse would make it through what was coming. Cassius did not listen. He had not listened to anyone in 8 years. He was not going to start now. He made it 3 miles. The horse made it 4. The horse came home alone 2 days later, with its saddle hanging sideways, and ice in its mane, and no rider. Cassius Thorne, by then, was 8 miles from the cabin, curled at the base of an outcrop of red rock, with the snow already drifted up to his shoulders. His fist was clenched, as if he had been reaching for something he could not name. But Maren did not know that. Not yet. Inside the cave, Maren Hollis was unaware that she had become a widow. She was simply living. Each morning, she woke on the stone bed with the wool shawl pulled to her chin, the fire from the night before reduced to a soft red bed of coals, the mortared walls holding the warmth like a held breath. She would lie there for a few minutes, listening to the silence of the chamber, to the distant moan of the wind on the surface 50 feet above her head, to the small, steady, reassuring sound of nothing trying to break in. Then she would rise, stir the fire, set water to boil, take out her grandmother's journal and read by the light of the new flame. I am safe, I am safe, I am safe. The blizzard outside hit the valley like a fist closing on a bird. For 6 days it did not stop. The temperature dropped to a level no one alive in Ironwood Hollow had ever seen. The spring froze across. Cattle died standing in their stalls. Trees split apart in the night with sounds like rifle shots. The Whitlock storage shed collapsed at 2 in the morning on a Thursday. Alonzo Whitlock threw himself against the main beam to hold the roof long enough for Prudence to drag the last of their preserved meat from beneath the falling timbers. The beam caught his shoulder, drove him to the ground. Prudence dragged him out one-handed. 5-year-old Tobias on her hip, 3-year-old Beulah clinging to the back of her nightgown. They walked half a mile through waist-deep snow to the Sedgwick house, where 3 other families had already gathered. By the 2nd night, Tobias began to cough. By the 4th night, the cough had a wetness in it that Prudence Whitlock recognized from a place inside her she had not visited since her own brother had died at age 4 in a Missouri winter 40 years before. She sat by her son in the gray light of the Sedgwick parlor, and she thought about every word she had ever said about Maren Hollis. It was Tabitha Fairchild who said it first. 3 families crowded into the front parlor of the Sedgwick house, the wind howling against the windows, the whiskey gone, the coffee gone. Tabitha sat near the fire, her hands wrapped around her cup. "We have not seen Mrs. Thorne since Mr. Thorne left for town." The room went quiet. Eamon Brackett, who had been standing near the window, turned his head slowly. Matthias Langford spoke first. "Thorne has been gone 3 weeks. Nobody has been out to check on her." The silence that followed had weight. It was the silence of collective guilt. Eamon Brackett stood at the window, and he remembered. A woman in the Fairchild store telling him about squirrels and pine cones and beavers. Himself, smiling, telling her that winter is winter. The memory had a different taste now. It tasted like iron. He turned to the room. In the morning, I am going. 3 men set out at first light. Eamon Brackett, Matthias Langford, Reuben Calloway. They broke trail through snow that came up past their knees, then their thighs, then their hips. The world was white in every direction, and behind them, in the line of footprints, came a 4th person, whom none of them had invited. Wren Calloway, 16 years old, with her father's spare wool coat pulled around her thin shoulders, her face turned away from the wind. Eamon told her twice to go back. She did not answer. She kept walking. The 4th set of prints that none of the men had asked for, and that none of them, in the end, could refuse. By the time the cabin appeared through the blowing snow, they had been walking for 4 hours. They forced the door open against the drift that had piled against it, and they walked into the empty house. It was exactly as Maren had left it, clean, organized, the pantry sorted, the dishes dry, the bed made. There were no signs of panic, no knocked-over chairs, no spilled flour. This was not the house of a woman who had been caught by surprise. This was the house of a woman who had left on her own terms. Eamon stood in the middle of the main room and looked around and understood. In the slow and painful way that proud men understand things they should have understood sooner, that she had been planning this for a long time, that she had been right, that he had not listened. Wren was the one who looked up. She was standing in the doorway, the wind whipping her hair across her face, her eyes scanning the slope of Ash Hill above the cabin. And she pointed. "There," she said, "between those 2 boulders, near the ridge." The men squinted. At first they saw nothing. Then Eamon saw it, a shimmer, a trembling, almost invisible. That was not wind, it was heat, a column of warmth rising from between the rocks on a day when no warmth should exist anywhere on that mountain. Eamon turned to the other men. "We climb." They climbed for nearly an hour. When they reached the spot, Eamon knelt at what appeared to be a natural rock slide. He pulled off his glove. He placed his bare hand on one of the stones, and he pulled it back as if he had touched a stove. "It is warm," he said, and then, from somewhere inside the mountain, they heard the sound of a lever moving across stone, and out of the opening crawled Maren Hollis, brushing the snow from her shawl with the calm of someone stepping out for the morning paper. "Mr. Brackett, I was not expecting visitors, but since you are here, come in, I have the fire going." What Eamon Brackett saw when he crawled through the opening, and passed through the airlock, and entered the main chamber, left him unable to speak. The walls, smooth and white with mortar, reflecting the firelight in a way that made the small space feel larger than it was. The hearth burning with a steadiness and an efficiency that Eamon, who had built chimneys himself, recognized instantly as first-rate work. The stone bed with its thick mattress, the shelves lined with provisions. Organized, sufficient. It was not a cave, it was a home. Matthias Langford, who had crawled in behind Eamon, murmured something the others heard. "She has been here since before winter started." Eamon did not respond. He was sitting on the edge of the stone platform, which was warm beneath his snow-soaked trousers, staring at the fire. "How long?" he finally asked. "Since early October," Maren said. "6 weeks. And Mr. Thorne." Maren's voice did not change. "Mr. Thorne went to town in October. I do not have information about when he plans to return." Eamon understood what was not being said. Then he said, very quietly, almost to himself, You told me to watch the squirrels." Marin did not respond. There was no need to respond. Wren Calloway, who had entered last, said in a low voice, "Did you build this alone?" It was not a question, it was a recognition. "Alone," Marin confirmed. Since last autumn, the cave could not shelter the entire town. But what it could do was become the center from which the town began to reorganize itself. The first problem was firewood. Marin had a map in her head of every deposit of dry fallen timber on the mountainside. Eamon organized work parties that went out each morning with her precise instructions. Within a week, the firewood crisis had eased. The second problem was heat. Marin spent 2 afternoons explaining how to improve their chimney systems, how to create effective draft, how to use the mass of stone as a heat accumulator. In 1 week, 3 houses had better chimneys. The third problem was the sick. Eamon came to the cave one afternoon with a grave face. 3 families, old Hetty Mosswood, the Whitlock boy, 5 years old, cough getting worse every day, and Matthias Langford, bedridden. Marin opened her grandmother's leather journal. She knew it by heart, but she opened it anyway, the way beloved books are opened, for the pleasure of seeing the handwriting of someone who is gone. And here was the twist that cut deeper than any winter cold. The child who was sickest was Tobias Whitlock, whose mother had spent the better part of a year trying to convince Ironwood Hollow that Marin Hollis had lost her mind. That woman now needed Marin to save her child. Marin did not pause to let the irony register. She opened the book and began preparing remedies. Hawthorn for the deep cough, willow bark in infusion for the fever, wild honey she had collected in summer, a warm clay poultice for the chest. Wren Calloway carried the remedies to town on a small sled her father had built for crossing the deep snow. Old Hetty Mosswood improved in 3 days. The Whitlock boy took longer. A full week of fever that rose and fell and rose again. On the 7th day, the fever broke. Tobias opened his eyes and asked for water, and Prudence Whitlock held her son against her chest and wept with the particular ferocity of a mother who has looked into the space where her child almost was not. 3 days after Tobias's fever broke, Prudence came to the cave, alone. She crawled through the entrance and stood in the main chamber and looked around. Her face held an expression Marin had seen before, the particular discomfort of a person whose map of the world has just been redrawn by someone they had placed at the margins. Marin was grinding dried mullein leaves in a stone mortar. She did not stop. Prudence stood for a long time. Then she spoke. Her voice was nothing like the voice she had used in the Fairchild store. "Thank you for saving my boy." Marin looked up. "Sit down, Prudence. Have some tea." Prudence sat. Marin poured tea from the pot she kept warm on a flat stone near the hearth. 2 women drank tea by the fire in a chamber inside a mountain, while outside, the worst winter in a generation continued its work on the world. Neither of them apologized in words, but Prudence held the cup with both hands, and her hands were shaking, and Marin saw the shaking, and said nothing about it, because there are reconciliations that are most honest when they need no words, because the available words are too small for what needs to be said. Prudence finished her tea. She set the cup down very carefully, and she looked at Marin with eyes that were red but dry. "He calls for you," she said. "When his fever spikes at night, he calls for the lady with the kind voice." Marin did not answer. Some sentences are not for answering. They are for sitting with. Prudence nodded, as if Marin had spoken anyway, and she crawled back out through the airlock, into the cold. She did not come back to the cave that winter, but every autumn for the rest of her life. When Maren walked up to inspect the cave before the first snow, she would find a loaf of bread waiting at the base of the outer wall, wrapped in clean cloth. No note. There was no need for a note. In April, when the thaw came, a trader from the south rode into Ironwood Hollow with news. A man named Cassius Thorne had been found, 8 miles from his ranch, at the base of a red rock outcrop, frozen. His horse had come home alone in February. His body had been buried in the drift until the spring thaw had revealed him. Eamon Brackett saddled his horse on a bright, cold afternoon and rode out to the foot of Ash Hill and climbed the slope to the cave. He stood at the outer wall, and he called Maren's name. She came out into the spring sunshine. With dirt on her hands from planting herbs in a small bed she had begun keeping near the entrance. He told her what he had heard. She listened. She did not speak. When he was finished, she sat down on a flat rock, and she looked out over the valley below, the patches of green beginning to show through the retreating snow, the spring rushing again. After months of silence, she did not feel triumph. She did not feel sorrow. She felt only the quiet recognition of a fact she had suspected for a long time. He had not listened when she told him about the squirrels. He had not listened when she told him about the pine cones. He had not listened when she said that winter is going to be different. The storm had come anyway. He had ridden into it. She had built a place to wait it out. That was the only difference between them. She turned to Eamon. "Thank you for telling me." He nodded. He did not press her. He did not try to fill the silence with the well-meaning words that men of his generation believed were comforts. He simply nodded and turned and walked back down the slope, to leave her alone with whatever this was. That afternoon, Maren went into the cave. She took down her grandmother's leather journal from its shelf. She opened it to the page on the uses of Artemisia, and she folded the small letter from the sheriff in Las Cruces and tucked it between the pages. She closed the book. She did not cry. She did not smile. She sat for a long time, with her hand on the book, and the spring sunshine coming through the small ventilation crack near the ceiling, throwing a thin gold line across the stone floor. And she felt, for the first time in 8 years and 7 months, a door that had been open for too long, finally close, with a soft and definitive click, and the room, beginning slowly, to recover its temperature. The town meeting was held in the Fairchild storeroom, 10 days after the thaw. Eamon had told Maren she needed to come. "You must be there," he said, "because the story we are going to tell is yours, and if you are not present, we are going to tell it wrong." She went. The storeroom was packed. Neil Fairchild had lit the iron stove in the corner, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the space. When Maren entered, there was a moment of silence that was not uncomfortable, but attentive. Eamon spoke first. "Most of you know what we found on the slope above the Thorne Ranch, and most of you know that without what Mrs. Hollis built there. Several of us would not be here this morning." Neil Fairchild cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hollis, would you explain to us how you built the cave, so that if another winter like this comes, we do not depend on one person having foreseen it?" It was the most humble and most important question anyone in the town had ever asked her. She looked at Wren, whose notebook was open on her knees, recording every word. She thought of her grandmother Sersa, who had told her that the world is always talking, and that you only need to be quiet enough to hear it. Then she began to speak. She spoke for almost an hour. She told them about the squirrels, the pine cones, the beavers, the cranes. She told them about reading wind, about listening for the second silence beneath the first, about what her grandmother had taught her. She told them about the chimney, the mortar, the bed, the provisions. She did not tell them about the fear. She did not tell them about the 8 years before. Those were her own. But she told them everything they needed to know, to prepare, the next time. When she finished, Reverend Beaumont stood up. The old minister looked older than he had before the winter. "I owe Mrs. Hollis an apology. I visited her home last summer because someone expressed concern that she was not well. I should have asked her what she was doing, instead of asking her if she was all right." The difference between those two questions is the most expensive lesson I learned this winter. It was the only apology spoken aloud in the entire story, and it came from the person least expected to give it. After the meeting, Eamon walked outside and stood alone in the spring sunshine, his face turned toward the slope where the cave was. Wren saw him standing there and did not approach. There are moments when a man needs to stand alone with the things he did not do, and the greatest respect you can offer is to let him stand. The cave became what the town came to call the Mountain Reserve, a community asset that belonged to everyone, and that no one could close or claim. Eamon helped Marin register the land around the cave in her own name, through a lawyer from Las Cruces who came to town the following spring. For the first time in her life, Marin Hollis owned something in her own name. Wren Calloway studied medicine in Albuquerque 6 years later, one of the first women in the region to do so. When the admissions panel asked what had led her to pursue medicine, she answered without hesitation, "A woman who taught me that the most important knowledge is knowledge learned by watching, and that preparation is the most honest form of love a person can have for her own life." The examiners did not fully understand the answer. Wren did not explain it. An October afternoon, many years later, the sun setting behind the western ranges, the sky the color of copper and wild honey. That belongs only to autumn in those mountains. Marin sat on the porch of the house that had once been Cassius Thorne's, and was now hers, her hair the color of the snow on the peaks, her hands knotted with decades of work. Wren sat beside her with a notebook open on her knees, the way she always sat, the way she had sat since she was 16 years old. "The squirrels are very active this year," Wren said, looking at the flats. Marin followed her gaze. "The pine cones have been sealed since August. The beavers reinforced the spring dam 3 weeks ago." Wren opened the notebook. Another hard winter. Marin considered the sky, the wind, the way the vegetation on the slope had changed colors a week early. Not as hard as that one, but more than people are expecting. Wren wrote that down. Then she closed the notebook for a moment and looked at Marin with the direct attention she had always had. "Do you miss it? The cave, I mean, living in there?" Marin thought about that, with the honesty that was the only way she thought about things worth thinking about. "I do not miss it the way you miss a place," she said finally. "I miss it the way you miss a moment in your life, the moment when you know exactly who you are, and exactly what you are doing, and exactly why." Wren nodded slowly, writing. "And the cave itself." Marin smiled, which was something she did not do often, but which, when she did, transformed her entire face into the face of a woman who has seen too much to be naive, but who still finds reasons to be present. "The cave has been ready for 30 years, she said. "That is what I built it for. Not to use it alone, for it to be there when it is needed." Wren closed the notebook, and the two women sat in silence, watching the mountains darken slowly under the October sky, and the first snow-covered peaks glinting in the distance. Because winter always comes. That does not change. What can change is whether you meet it prepared or empty-handed, while everyone else was looking the other way. Marin picked up a stone, and then another, and then another, and built a thing that no one had asked for and no one understood, until they needed it. So, look at your own mountain, the one you have been watching quietly, the one you know is coming, even when no one else believes you. What stones are you laying?